Welcome back to video number 2 in the Cypress Testing tutorial video series. In this video, we're going to be using the get and find commands, along with a few other little extras to write our first tests and see how to navigate around the DOM using Cypress. So by the end of this video, you'll have written your first Cypress test. You'll understand how to target different things on the screen using the get command, and we'll also talk about find and within. And then we'll differentiate between this Cypress get and find commands and find use cases for each. So we're back here in our kitchen sink application. And it'll be helpful to take a look at some of these, one of these example files just to kind of get some structure and see what's going on. So inside, we'll open up actions.spec.js. And we can see a couple of things. First, we wrap our entire series of tests with this context. And it's just basically a general description of what's happening in that given test file. So it takes a string as the first argument, where it's just the description, and then it takes a callback function, which will then run the rest of our tests. Secondly, you may notice this before each. Before each is a helpful tool that can, as the name implies, run certain commands before each of your tests. So rather than writing cy.visit, and in this case, this is just visiting a URL, rather than writing that at the beginning of each of your tests over and over, Cypress has developed a way to reuse commands with these before each, and we've got after each as well as another option. So once that's all taken care of, now we can write our individual tests, and these are typically written with these it statements. So similar to context, it'll take in a string, which is the description of like what's going on in that test, and then it'll take a callback function, which will then run your tests. So what we can do is inside of examples, I'm going to create a new file. And we'll say my first test.spec.js. I'm actually going to grab this URL. We can just visit that same one. And this is actually, so if you wanted to run this locally, you could. There's a series of start commands for Windows specifically, and then if you're on Mac or Linux, you can run it as well. And that way, if you wanted to run tests and like update DOM elements and text and that kind of stuff, you could actually change the files and then have the Cypress runner pointing at your local host. But in this case, for this example, we're just going to point to the live kitchen sink URL, and this URL is the live version of what you see here in the code. So we'll give it some context, and we'll say my first test, and then we'll do the callback function where we actually tell it to do stuff. We'll write a before each where we can visit that link. So before each just takes in this callback function, and we can say cy.visit and the URL. And so now we can actually write our first test, but before we do, we want to see kind of what we're working with. So if I grab this URL, I'll flip over to the kitchen sink app, and this is that URL. And so the nice thing about kitchen sink is not only does it give you an opportunity to practice, but the actual site, the actual project is a bunch of documentation that shows you how to do a lot of stuff. So what we want to do is we want to say like, okay, this page should have an H1 element. It should exist somewhere on the page. And so we can see one. We think that that's probably an H1, but to be sure, we can open up the inspector and we can see indeed that it is an H1 element. We can see some classes as well. Somewhere down here, there's IDs. So you're pretty typical HTML DOM here. So if we flip back, we're going to make sure that an actions H1 exists. So before each we're visiting, then we'll say it has an H1 on the page. So that's the string describing the test, and you can put in whatever you want for that string, just something that's relevant. And then we'll say cy.get h1 that should exist. So what's happening here? cy is kind of our base Cypress like instantiator, and then off of that we can provide a series of chained commands. And so the basic one is get. So get is going to find all elements that you that match the given tag or class name or ID, etc. So in this case, if there was more than one h1, which there shouldn't be on a page, but if there were, it would actually get all of the h1s on the page. So what we're doing here is we're saying cy.get, so give me an h1, and it should exist. Now, notice that I'm just passing in h1. If I wanted to target a class like container, for example, I would just provide the dot syntax like you're doing in if you've used jQuery, this might look familiar, or CSS when you're writing your CSS, and then same thing with IDs with that hashtag. So since we're just targeting the h1, we don't need anything beforehand. We just need the element itself. And then we're going to run, you can double check in the package JSON for all of these scripts, but we're just going to be running cy_open. So I can do npm run cy:\open. So now we've got our test suite here. And we don't want to run all of these. We just want to run that individual test file. So we can click on my first test.spec.js. And it passes. So you can see what's happening here before it's visiting that link. We're getting an h1, and it should exist. So when you use the get command, what it's doing is typically it's using the Cypress root element, and in most cases that's like the page level. So anything on the page from top to bottom is within the scope of the get command. So it's going to find any single h1. So we can take this a step further, and we can say it renders the correct h1 text, and let's actually get this one to fail on purpose. So we can say cy.get h1 should, and we can say contain text, and let's say Cypress. If we save that and flip back over, we can see that this failed. And if we run it again, so the h1 renders, but it expected h1 to contain text Cypress, but the text was actions. So the good news is it's reading the correct text. The bad news in this case, which we knew was going to be bad news, is that the test fails because we told it the wrong string. So let's go ahead and fix that. It should contain text actions. Save. Flip back over. And now it does render the correct text. Nice. So the next thing is we talked about kind of the difference between get and find. Or mentioned that we were going to differentiate between the two. So as I mentioned, get is the entire page, but what if we wanted to target something just within this container? Well, what we could do is we could actually we could use that get command, we could figure out whatever this container is called, if it's a div or if it has a class name or whatever. We could get that, and then we could chain on the find command to then find one single element within this that given class. And so since this is actually a browser, we can just go ahead and open the inspector here. So we can open up the inspect. We can narrow this down a little bit, give us some more space. So we've got an ID of app. It looks like it's over there. Let's see. So let's right click on actions and then inspect. Okay. So actions, there's our H1. So it looks like it's within a class of container. And then we can see a paragraph tag there as well. So what we can do is we can say like, okay, let's get this container class, and then let's make sure that there's some sort of paragraph text. Let's just make sure that a paragraph element exists on this page. Again, not a super in-depth test, but just a way to kind of show how this find command works. So the class is container. So we can say it renders a paragraph under the H1. And so now what we'll do is we'll do cy.get, and we'll pass in the class syntax with the dot at the beginning, so dot container. So now it's going to grab that container, and then we can say find, and we'll just have it look for a paragraph tag. So similar to get, but now we're within that scope of the container rather than the entire document. And then we can say like should exist. Okay, so we can see they're all passing. We'll run it again so you can see that. We can close the inspector. And so what happens here is if we click this renders a paragraph under the H1, we can see that before each runs, we get the container, and then we find that paragraph tag, so this container. And actually it looks like there might be multiple containers because it's highlighting a number of elements. So let's see. So let's scroll down. And I'm going to open up the inspector one more time. So on, let's say near the type. So we have container. Okay, so it looks like there are actually several containers. So this test worked because there are paragraph tags existing in all of the containers. But we wanted just this first container. And there's actually a way to do that. So we can flip back over. And so I mentioned cy.get will start at the root level of the page and then find all elements with this selector. So what we can do is after the container, we can do .first. And what this will do is we're going to grab all the containers, and then we're going to grab the first one. And in that first one, we're going to find a paragraph tag, and it should exist. Okay, so let's take a look. So we got our container. The first one, okay, so it looks like the first one is actually this nav bar. So let's try and target the second. So you might think like, okay, let's type in second. But that isn't showing up. We could do last, but that's not going to help us because there are a bunch of elements on the page. So what we can actually do, you can do first, you can do last, or you can do equals. And equals starts at 0. It's a 0 indexed helper that will help you target a specific element. So if we get all the containers and we want the second one, then we would do equal 1. So that's, remember, 0, 1. This would be the second element. And so now it passes. And if we take a look, we're getting all the containers. Now we're just getting that second one with an index of 1, and we're finding a paragraph tag, and it exists. So that's awesome. Now let's, presumably this, if these are all the containers and that's the first one, or that, excuse me, that's the one with an index of 1, which is the second, we can take a look at this next container, and we can show the difference between find and within. So within this container here, if we right click on type, you can see there's an H4, we scroll up, so this is a container. There's some actions. There's a row. So we can do a couple of different things. So we can say it renders a section with the correct elements. And so what we want to do is we'll do cy.get container or dot container. So we're going to grab all of the containers. Then we're going to grab the third one with an index of 2, which in this case, container 1, container 2, container 3. Index of 0, index of 1, index of 2. So that's why we have equals 2. So that should give us this container. And then we can do dot within. Now within is similar to find. However, you're not just limited to one single piece here. So notice that I can get this container, I can find this specific one, and then I can find a paragraph tag inside of that container because the scope has changed. However, the issue is let's say I want to find multiple elements or do multiple things. I couldn't do that with find. But within, I'm getting the container that's at index 2, and then I'm changing the scope so that I'm no longer targeting elements all across the screen. I'm only targeting elements within that specific container. So now we can do cy.get h4 that should exist, and I can do same thing. I can do cy.get paragraph that should exist. And so now if I flip over, you can see that that passed, and I'll just open this up. So we're getting the containers, all of them. Now we're getting it with the index of 2, and you can see that it highlighted the one that started with .type. And now within that container, we're getting an h4, and we're getting a paragraph tag. So that's what we want, which is super helpful to prevent it from getting all of the different h4s and paragraph tags. So super helpful there, and super helpful series of commands to get you started with writing tests. So these are pretty simple. They're just kind of render-based tests just to make sure that things are showing up on the page. But we've seen a couple of different examples. So one, before each, which is not even targeting specific elements, just a nice helper method to save you from retyping the same command. We've seen the get command, which is going to start at the document root level and find all elements that match your element or your class or your ID. We've seen assertions, so if they should exist or they should contain text or things like that. We've seen the ability to change the scope with find so that you get a specific element, and then in that you can find a single element and do some tests on it. And then additionally, we've done the within command, the within chained command, where you can change the scope and run a series of tests within a certain element on the page. In the next video, what we're going to do is take a look at installing our first plugin. So the Cypress community has a wide array of plugins that can be helpful for certain use cases. And in this case, we're going to be using a plugin called Cypress Testing Library, which will kind of enhance some of the default locators that we already get out of the box with Cypress, and provide some useful functionality for writing more tests. So that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for following along. If you're looking to learn more in the meantime, you can always check out our blog at lambdatest.com/blog, as well as a community page at community.lambdatest.com. You can find cool things like how to write more tests, how to utilize the Lambda test platform, how to find ways to get certified with Cypress. So lots of cool information there. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.